Hey there, art nerds. So today I have a really cute seasonal start to finish tutorial for you guys. Today we are going to draw, ink, and paint this adorable pumpkin witch and her two cat familiars. I'll have everything you need linked down in the description below. And if you don't feel like drawing and inking, my wonderful patrons have the line art over on Patreon. So if you head on over to patreon.com/natosoup, you can print it out and just paint along with me. I am so excited to share this with you guys today, so let's get going. Over to the left, I have my sketchbook, which has a rough thumbnail sketch of the idea. I'm dividing the page into thirds, and I am placing our little pumpkin witch along the leftmost third of the grid. If you're looking for some more tutorials on composition, I've got you covered. Check the description down below. I'll have that and some other drawing tutorials linked for you guys. I start out by just kind of roughly sketching everything using Pentel red lead, and I'm using a modified stick figure to sketch out our little witch. If you're looking for more tutorials on how I like to draw people, I'll have those linked for you guys as well. So once I have the basics roughly placed, the giant pumpkins around her feet, a stick figure, and the pumpkin that she's holding just super roughly sketched in, I'm going to start tightening things up. And I apologize that this is difficult to see. It is a combination of I have to sketch really lightly because otherwise colored lead is going to be much harder to remove. And I also am working very lightly, so it can be hard for my camera to pick it up. But once I've got the gist sketched in, I can remove my thumbnail sketchbook and we can actually get a better look at what I'm drawing. So you guys can see kind of the rough under sketching. If you guys are looking for more tutorials on how I draw clothes, let me know. I would be happy to create some new ones. I just need to know if there's interest. I do have some tutorials on how I draw clothes and I'll link them for you guys, but I realize I don't have as many as I thought I did. So if that's something you're interested in, make sure you let me know down in the comments below. I am going to start by kind of just breaking down her face, and I have some tutorials where I walk you guys through that process in more depth as well. So make sure you check that description because there are a lot of really good tutorials for you guys. This has been sped up 4x and it is about an hour in length. So I want you guys to keep in mind that everything is going to take a lot longer. And I've also cut out all of the times where I need to erase. So just be patient with yourself, give yourself plenty of time, and take breaks if necessary. So she's wearing kind of a pinafore dress, and I'm actually referencing that from somebody on Pinterest. I'll try to grab the name of the person who is modeling it because apparently they're quite popular in the cottagecore community. But I really just wanted kind of the gist of how the dress flows and the details for the dress just to give me a rough idea. I frequently reference things. In fact, as I am sketching in one of our two cats down at the bottom below, I actually am referencing cats stretching. And this is something I really want to emphasize because I have found while working on my Easily Influenced series that a lot of other artists don't mention whether or not they're referencing or how often they're referencing. Y'all, I am referencing basically all the time just so that I understand how the world around me actually looks so I can cartoon and caricature it. So you guys see me erasing and fixing and adjusting. That's because even though I'm drawing really simplified cartoony cats and I'm trying to capture the gesture of the stretch, I'm still going to be referencing it to make sure it actually looks right. So I really want to normalize referencing and looking things up as part of the artistic process because I am frustrated by how many professional artists who are out there with books and popular channels who don't mention that at all. I am also referencing pumpkins and I wanted to draw a variety of pumpkins, white, orange, and green pumpkins. So of course I Googled unique pumpkins or something along those lines, and I'm using that to really inspire me and inspire how I'm drawing the pumpkins and what shapes I'm using for the pumpkins. Basically, I start with kind of oblong or all oval shapes, and then I break them down into segments. And I really wanted it to be just kind of a fun and lively little illustration. So we've got pumpkins in a variety of sizes. I also referenced a sitting cat for the cat that's a little bit further back in the background. Reference is your friend. Please utilize it. Understand how the world around you works. Don't rely entirely on your imagination. So you guys remember that thumbnail sketch? That was just me capturing something from my imagination, super loose, super quick, kind of ugly, down on paper, so that later on when I had the time, I could sit down and look things up and figure out how I wanted things to actually look. So for her hat, I have been super inspired by all of those really cute mushroom hats that I've seen on Pinterest. I don't have time to make one of my own, but I can draw it and paint it for you guys. So I wanted kind of a mushroom witch hat, and we're referencing fly agaric. So that is the red cap mushroom with the little white scales and the white gills underneath. That's kind of the inspiration for her hat here. So every time I need to erase and clean up the lines underneath, I stop the camera, and I do that so I'm not shaking the camera to bits. Once I have a sketch that I'm happy with and I've removed all of the excess lines, the construction lines, the underdrawing lines that I don't need, I can start inking. And I am inking with a brush pen that is both waterproof and alcohol marker proof, the Sakura Pigma FB. I use this all the time. I really, really like this brush pen. You guys see this come up in a lot of my inking and watercolor tutorials. Speaking of, if you guys are looking for more inking tutorials, make sure you check that description below. I will also have all of the materials that I used for this tutorial linked for you guys as well. So just like with the initial sketching stage, this has been sped up 4x. Take your time, take breaks, move the sketchbook around so that you can get the angle that is the most comfortable for your hand. I also decided to add a little detail of like looped pearls going around the rim of the hat. And rather than draw all that individually, because honestly, I'm trying to save myself wear and tear on my hands, I inked that and I just drew the loops without drawing all the little individual beads. So I'm saving the individual beads for the inking stage, which we are going through right now. So when I'm inking, I usually work from foreground to background, inking the objects that overlap before I ink the objects that are being overlapped, but I will often start with the faces whenever possible, because those are the things that if I make a mistake, people are going to be the most likely to notice that. And I want to do it while my hand is still fresh and I haven't started to have hand cramps or hand pain. I did ink the pearls first since those overlap the face. And honestly, if I were to do this again, I would just leave the pearls off because they create a lot of visual clutter on her face. So if you're doing this at home and you'd like to make a better choice than what I made, I would recommend that you just go ahead and skip the pearls, or maybe leave the pearls for just the back, or simplify the design because it is a lot of clutter around the face, which is already kind of small. So as you guys know, I am inking with a Sakura Pigma FB brush pen. I am inking in a Canson XL watercolor sketchbook. So a big part of the start to finish series is these more simple watercolor illustrations than what I would typically do, walking you guys through the process in a way that's easy, hopefully easy for you guys to follow along, whether you want to draw with me, ink with me, or paint with me, or do all three. I do provide the line arts to my patrons though, because sometimes you just want to relax and get to painting. You don't want to have to spend time sketching and you don't want to have to spend time inking. But I will say that I encourage you guys to take the time to draw and ink, even if you make some mistakes, even if you're not happy with the end result, because that's how you're going to improve as an artist. And I have a bunch of drawing and comic tutorials here on the channel because I really want to teach you guys how to draw. Drawing has been something that I have loved and have enjoyed doing since I was 13 years old, and I am far, far, far older than 13. It has brought me so much joy and given me a chance to express myself to other people in a way that sometimes words can't really suffice. And I love this kind of cartooning and comic art because I find the simplification to just be really fun. And it really allows me to get emotive with the expressions and with the body language. So if that sounds fun to you, if that sounds like something you would like to learn how to do, and it's never too late to start learning how to draw, I have a lot of drawing and comic tutorials. I'll link a few of them for you guys down in the description below, but I hope you'll check the rest of them out and maybe make drawing part of your life and hopefully make art a habit. So a little bit of inking advice, not too much because I do have some tutorials where I'd go over it in more depth. And if you guys are watching my start to finish series, you're going to hear me say the same things over and over again. And I know I do repeat myself as someone with ADHD and short-term memory problems. I'm sure I forget and I tend to reiterate things too many times, but I don't want to do it too much. I don't want to bore you guys. I am using a brush pen because brush pens are really cool in that if you use fine liners, right? You need a size 8 and a size 5 and a size 3. You need a bunch of different fine liners to get all these different line weights. That or you're pressing down really heavy and you're busting through your pins very quickly. A brush pen is wonderful because you just need one pin. And with a little bit of pressure, you get really light, delicate, airy lines. And with heavier pressure, you get heavier lines. And if you want to ink light things like feathers and hair, you just need a little bit of pressure. And if you want to ink heavy things like rocks and roadways and concrete, you can bear down more. And if you want to create the impression of shadow, you can bear down. And if you want to create the impression of light, you can lighten up your pressure. Brush pens are so much fun. They do take some getting used to. They do take some practice. So I really do recommend that you give them a try and be patient with yourself. That is going to be the reoccurring theme, is patience. It takes time to become good at things. You can't just pick up a brush and become awesome at watercolor in just a month. And I'm not going to promise you guys anything that I don't think you can actually do. But I do think if you're willing to put the time in, if you're willing to make mistakes, and if you're willing to erase sometimes, I definitely think you can learn how to draw, you can learn how to ink, you can learn how to paint, and hopefully I'll be here with you helping you guys learn every step of the way because I'm still learning. That's a beautiful thing about being an artist and making art, is that you are still learning, you are still developing, you're still making mistakes, and you're still discovering things that you love. And one thing that I discovered that I love is I love creating these more simplified, and I say that because I am normally a watercolor comic artist. I paint the watercolor comics 7-inch Kara, which you guys can read for free as a webcomic at 7inchkara.com. I sure hope you guys will. That is pretty complicated, but I've got tutorials to walk you guys through how I paint comics. But I also make watercolor illustrations, and those tend to be quite a bit more complicated and more time consuming than what we're doing here. And something that I love about these start to finish tutorials is they are much, much quicker than what I'm normally doing. And there is something super satisfying about drawing and inking and painting in a sketchbook. And then when you finish the sketchbook, you have this sketchbook full of illustrations. And maybe some of them are not so great. You can cut those out and get rid of them if you want to. But even the failures are a nice record of the effort that you put in and the time that you put in and the journey that you're taking. And the internet really teaches us to kind of curate how we share our lives and what we show in our lives so that people don't ever see our mistakes. And as an ADHD woman, I hate that because I make a lot of mistakes. So while I don't always show you guys all of my failures, there's plenty of art that I don't super love, and I still share it over on my Instagram because it's important for me to share that process and to share that journey. And every day that I make art is a day that I see as a win. And if I can help you guys pick up that mindset, then dang, I did my job for the day, and that makes me really happy. So I am kind of taking my time inking this, probably listening to music or maybe listening to a podcast, and just kind of enjoying the process and not trying to work too quickly. If you're just getting started with inking though, a little bit of a tip, and this applies to watercolor and drawing as well, is that if you want to ink a really long line, pull from your shoulder. Use as much of your arm as you can. And that means having space to work. So you guys notice there's not a bunch of stuff on my desk. That gives me a lot of room to rotate my sketchbook and to be able to move things around and to move my arm freely without trying to avoid things. So I know some of us are working in really cramped environments, really limited space environments. If you can, I would recommend you either clear off your space, clear off your table, or if that is not possible for you, purchasing a lap board or purchasing a large clipboard or purchasing just a piece of wood that you can just kind of plop on the table or lean against the table and give yourself some space. That will be super helpful because I recognize that many of you guys are still living at home with your parents, or you have kids yourself and space and time are limited. So on that note, if you wanted to break this up and make it a little bit more accessible, you could do your sketch on one day, you could do your inks on another day, and then you could break up your watercolor over the course of a couple days. And I know that's the tricky part because that often means leaving your stuff out, and I know that not everyone can do that. So I allowed my inks to cure for 24 hours before I started painting. And this allows the pigment in the ink to really bond to the paper. Now I am mixing up a wash of Payne's Gray with a little bit of ultramarine blue and a little bit of burnt umber, and I am applying that to the background, and that gives us this really nice atmospheric gray color that's going to make our oranges really pop in this illustration without creating as much contrast as if we had gone for a blue sky background. That would give us a lot of contrast, but maybe a little bit too much. And we do want just a little bit of moodiness here because it is fall. And for many people, fall means cooler weather and overcast days. Now, I live in Southeast Louisiana. We get fall for like a week. And then our winter is basically what everybody else thinks of as fall. So I don't have the same appreciation and love of fall that everybody else who lives in cooler climates does, but I wanted to try and capture that as much as possible. So you guys see me pulling out Chinese watercolor weights rather than using a clip to hold the page down. It is just a matter of preference. I got these on Amazon. I love these things. I use the heck out of these things. And all they do is they provide a little bit of extra weight on your page to hold it down and keep it from buckling while you're painting. Now, if you are new to watercolor, some people try to tell me that they can do watercolor on any paper they come across. And while technically that might be true, and I have done the same thing, you want to be picky about your paper to an extent. In fact, I have a video on why you probably don't want to do your best watercolor illustrations. Did I say a paper? I have a video on why you probably don't want to do your favorite and best watercolor illustrations in your sketchbook that I will link for you guys. Not to yuck anyone's yum, but working on a heavier paper for watercolor is going to help prevent it from buckling and tearing and pilling all over the place. So I have this wash here. I've rinsed out my quill, and now I'm dabbing in some water, and we are creating intentional bleeds and backgrounds because with watercolor, as you add more water, it's going to push the areas that have pigment out of the way and create these blooms. Now, sometimes that happens and you don't want it to happen. We're doing that on purpose today. I'm going to mix our gray a little bit darker so that we get more of a striking effect when we do these blooms and backgrounds. And I'm going to apply another layer. And I am painting today with natural hair quills. Quills can be quite pricey, but I've actually found some vendors both on AliExpress and Amazon who make quills that I like, and it's a price point that's not so terribly shocking. So I'll try to remember to link those when I link the rest of our materials in the description below. I am also painting with this ginormous custom palette, my Daily Driver watercolor palette. This is what I use for most of my watercolor illustrations and my comic pages. This is the result of 15 years of amassing and hoarding different professional grade watercolors. You absolutely do not need a palette this size to paint. Although if you're curious about why I have such a large watercolor palette, I do actually have a vlog in defense of this palette. Do I use all of these colors? Yes. Do I use all of these colors in one illustration? No. And you can probably get by with a 12 color or even a 24 color palette. And I have reviewed some great student grade and professional grade paints. So if you're looking for some recommendations, make sure you check the description below. And these really are a mix of different professional paints. We have Winsor & Newton and Daniel Smith, and we have Holbein, and we have PwC and Sennelier and M. Graham's and Core watercolors. I really have a lot of different brands here. I'm pretty brand agnostic. So I'm going to start on her hat, and I mixed up kind of a creamish brown color, probably using a little bit of that burnt umber, maybe a little bit of Van Dyke brown, maybe a little bit of burnt sienna, but really we're going for vibes here rather than exact colors. So feel free to take this illustration in whatever direction you want to take it in. Feel free to use whatever colors that make your heart sing. Feel free to make her whatever color you would like to make her, and feel free to make whatever changes you wish. But if you do paint along with me, regardless of your color choices, I would love to see it. So please consider tagging me when you share it at NattoSoup, Nattosoup, because I would love to see your take on this. So at the tops of her eyes, I added a little bit of ultramarine blue. This is just to create some shading on the whites of her eyes and give us a little bit of depth so they don't feel too flat. I have also mixed up a skin tone, and I did not catch what I did, but I do actually have tutorials where I show you guys how I mix various skin tones, so I'll try to remember to link that for you guys. I think you guys will really dig it. It looks like it is a mix of some burnt sienna, some yellow ochre, and maybe a little bit of scarlet red. But if you're new to watercolor or you're new to painting people, I recommend that you swatch as you go on the same type of watercolor paper that you're using for the illustration until you get a really good feel for painting skin tones. Now, as someone who has painted hundreds of comic pages and hundreds of illustrations, I have a pretty good feel for what I want out of skin tones, but I do still swatch from time to time. So one of my approaches to watercolor is layering and glazing. So I start by applying a really light base coat of my color, and then I build up our saturation, I build up our shadow, I build up our contrast with subsequent layers of color. Different watercolor artists have different techniques that they like to use, but this one is pretty dang easy to do, and it works on a variety of papers, whether you're using cellulose like we're using today, or whether you're using a cotton rag paper. So I have grabbed a nice warm yellow, and I am using that as the base color for the pumpkin that she's holding, and I'm using a smaller round watercolor brush to apply this. So what you guys see on the table is a combination of quills as well as a combination of rounds, and they all basically come to a rounded pointed shape, which make them great for painting people, for painting objects, and for painting animals. They're just kind of good multi-purpose brushes, and they're pretty easy to use. My black handle brushes are silver black velvet brushes. Those are a mix of squirrel and synthetic. And the teal handled brushes are Diane W watercolor brushes, which were probably white labeled from Art Secret, and I believe they are just natural fibers. Now I have grabbed some undersea green from Daniel Smith, added a whole bunch of water, and I am actually painting some of my pumpkins green, and I have my reference up on my computer screen while I'm painting this. So if you are painting along with me today, I really do recommend that you reference these things so that we can get a good feel for the colors that we want and kind of just the schema we're trying to create, the vibes we're trying to create with this illustration. So for right now, we're kind of starting with the lighter colors first. Like I'm using this light tannish brown that I've mixed to paint the gills on the underside of her hat, as well as the scales on top of her hat. I'm going to let that fully dry, and I have grabbed a small container of masking fluid, and I like to use Winsor & Newton's removable masking fluid. I guess I'm letting that area dry first, and I have grabbed some Sennelier's Chinese orange, and I am using that that for the underdress. I guess it would just be her dress, and then the apron she's wearing on top of her dress would just be the pinafore. And I thought it would be really cute to have kind of a pumpkin colored dress for our little pumpkin witch. At this stage, for the most part, I am filling things in. I'm applying the base colors and just kind of figuring things out. We're painting on cellulose today, and cellulose has different working properties from cotton rag papers. You can layer on it, but you do need to be a little bit more patient. It doesn't lock in the pigments into the fibers quite as well. And I find that using synthetic watercolor brushes on cellulose, I tend to scrape up the pigments more. So it really is going to come down to what you like to paint with, what you're comfortable with, and what you have. But I will offer recommendations along the way, just in case you guys are looking to like try something new or maybe elevate your watercolor game just a little bit. Now, one of the tricks that I do for painting quicker is I will kind of paint everything at the same time, but I am not painting any two objects that are both wet at the same time. So you can really see that with the pumpkins, unless I want it to bleed into each other, creating a wet into wet blend. Sometimes that is really fun and that adds a lot of liveliness. It really just kind of depends on what I'm going for. On a cotton rag paper, there's a high likelihood that I will do that and other fun techniques. But on a cellulose paper like this, where it can only take so much water, it can only take so much pigment, it can only take so much working at a time, I'm going to keep it pretty simple. So for a while, I'm just kind of blocking things in. It doesn't really require a lot of fancy brush work. However, if you're more confident in your brush work and you want to try some fun things out, you are definitely welcome to do so. But this is also a pretty simple stage, and if you just want to color it in, go for it. Now with the larger pumpkin, I am starting to try to build up some lighting and some contrast. I'm trying to make sure that you guys can see the crenellations on the pumpkin, so like, you know, where the different segments divot in, and this is where using reference can just be super helpful and can really give you a better idea of how things really look and how you might want to handle this in watercolor. Now that I've got my pumpkins kind of blocked in, I've decided I definitely need some more contrast because her dress is a little bit too pumpkin-y. So I'm adding in a warmer reddish brown. I believe it is quinacridone burnt sienna from Turner, in case you guys are curious. And that's going to kind of help push it away from just her being a pumpkin among the pumpkins. Of course, if you want her to be a pumpkin among the pumpkins, you can go for it. And if you'd like to create a lot of contrast, you can actually give her a blue or a turquoise blue dress, and that's gonna really pop against these pumpkins. Really, it is up to you and what you want from this, but I wanted a kind of simplified color scheme where our real pop of contrasty color was coming from the oranges of the pumpkin, and then everything else was a little bit more subdued and a little bit more muted. So while I'm giving the pumpkins a chance to dry, we are going to apply our Winsor Newton removable masking fluid, and I am using a synthetic brush that I have worked some brush soap into. So the brush soap is still in the brush, and that prevents the brush from absorbing the masking fluid and ruining the brush. Of course, you don't want to use a brush that you really like for this, but you may want to use a smaller pointed synthetic for this because that's going to be able to get into those fine details like all those little scales on her cap. With masking fluid, you don't want to paint over it while it's still wet. So while I'm waiting for it to dry, I'm going to add another layer to her skin tone. And I am just keeping her skin super simple. We're not going to be using the red violets that I usually like to use to add shadow and contrast, because in this start to finish series, we're just really trying to work with what our sketchbook is giving us, and we're trying to work with some really simple and basic techniques to make it just a little bit easier and a little bit more approachable. So basically, I'm just going to mix her skin tone a little bit darker and apply another layer. So with the pumpkin that she's holding, I decided it was still too close in color to the dress, so I'm applying a glaze of our warm yellow to it, as well as some of the other pumpkins in the background, just so that we get more of a color story going on. We get a little bit more contrast, we get some more variety. Also, for this cute little baby pumpkin down at the bottom, still referencing pumpkins by the way, I'm going to do a little bit of a wet into wet technique so that we get some interesting spotting on it. So for her hat, we're going to be doing wet into wet as well. I am starting with a layer of our warm yellow, and since I'm working on a cellulose paper, I need it to stay wet to get that wet into wet transition. So we are really applying a lot of yellow, a lot of paint to it so that it's still going to stay wet. While that is still wet, we're going to start working in some of our orange and allowing it to diffuse into our yellow. This can be a little bit more challenging to do on a cellulose paper like this. So if you're not super confident with this technique, or if you're not sure if you can work fast enough for it, don't worry about trying to do the wet into wet like we're doing. Just kind of concentrate on doing a yellow layer and then an orange layer once the yellow layer is dried, and then a red layer once the orange layer has dried. But if you're feeling brave, or if you're interested in trying something new, the next color we grabbed is a really bright red scarlet that we're kind of dabbing into our orange while it's still wet and allowing it to diffuse out. Now, if you're interested in painting more fly agaric or more fly agaric inspired girls, I've got like several more of them in my start to finish tutorial series. We paint a lot of mushrooms here, so I'll try to remember to link them, but I'm definitely going to link the playlist for you guys, and I really encourage you guys to paint along with me. Warm yellow is definitely a color you're going to want to have on hand. It could be cadmium yellow. It could even be like new gamboge, but you do want a warm yellow on hand for today's tutorial since we're doing so much with orange. And you don't have to have undersea green. Undersea green is a Daniel Smith convenience color that is a combination of like indigo blue, so maybe some hooker's green, and maybe some yellow, and it granulates out beautifully. But for this, really all you need is kind of a muted green, which you could mix by mixing sap green with maybe a little bit of indigo, or maybe even a little bit of Payne's gray. A lot of my watercolor process is paint something, see how I feel about it, and then adjust it. And you guys are going to see me continue to work with and adjust the underlayer of her dress quite a bit. We're going for another layer of our quinacridone burnt sienna, and we're really trying to push it more into kind of like a orangey red or a rusty red color rather than just straight up orange. The first layer on her hat has dried, it is desaturated quite a bit, which is something that happens with watercolor, so we are going to add another layer to it. So I have added another layer of orange, and then while that's still red, I'm going in with our scarlet and adding that in wet into wet and letting it blend out. Don't be discouraged if your watercolors dry a little bit lighter, a little more muted, not as pretty or as jewel-like as they are when they were wet. It just takes work, it just takes layering, and it just takes practice to get your watercolors to do what you want them to do. But I firmly believe in you. I think you've got it in you, and I am here to encourage you. So I decided that I want even more scarlet red on our mushroom cap because it's reading a little bit orange, and while you could definitely go in that direction, that's not really what I'm looking for today. So I did another layer of red on our cap, and now I'm going to continue to work on developing the shadows and the contrast on the pumpkins. And it's really just a matter of creating layers, letting them dry, maybe mixing your colors a little bit more saturated, and just working on it. And patience. Patience is such a huge part of watercolor, at least for me. Different artists have different styles, and some people can do much more immediate, vibrant, and lively watercolors. And I think that is fantastic, and that's definitely a skill set I'd like to continue to hone. But for me, watercolor is also a relaxing activity that I do to help me unwind. And if it takes time, that's good too. I don't have to be in a rush. So I already know that I want the pinafore on her dress to be brown. And I am also painting her hair dark brown just to kind of match. We're working with kind of a limited color story, a limited color palette here. So one of my tricks for color theory, and it's very hackish, not necessarily so much as a trick, is just to keep it very limited, keep it simple. If you work with analogous colors and with a few pops of complementary color here and there, it's really kind of hard to go wrong with that. So I'm using a similar color for the pinafore on her dress. I'm going to start by painting that base layer, and I've actually mixed it a little bit darker, and I've added in some Payne's gray just to mute it a little bit so it's not exactly the same color as her dress. Here's something that's kind of cool that I noticed while editing. If you watch, you can actually see the brown on her dress drying. So sometimes it is a really nice, not too humid night, and I can basically paint something all the way through straight shot if I want to. But sometimes it's a very humid night and I have to take a lot of breaks in order to give it a chance to dry. And I cut the breaks out because, I mean, that's like literally watching paint dry, and most people would not be interested in that. But you do need to give yourself a break, give yourself fresh eyes, especially if you're starting to feel kind of frustrated, or you feel like you've hit the ugly phase, or you're just not quite sure what to do next. Give yourself a nice break, go for a walk, take a nap, have a snack, drink some water, but also to give your paints a chance to dry. I find that a lot of beginner artists often don't yet have that relationship with their watercolors when they know whether or not they should go ahead and add some more while it's still wet and get a really cool wet into wet effect, or if they should let it finish drying and then add another layer on top of it. And honestly, the only way you're going to get there is through practice and trying things and maybe making mistakes and learning how to make it work. And that is something that I can't teach you, that a book can't teach you. You just got to try it out and do it yourself. But I hope that these start to finish tutorials are encouraging you guys to do just that and to make it easier and to make it a little bit more accessible. Basically, unless I tell you guys otherwise, we are mostly just doing layering, straightforward layering in our start to finish series. So I am working on her hair. I am using a smaller round. So generally, I would encourage you guys to use the largest watercolor brush you are comfortable with using for the given whatever you are painting. But with hair, I really like to do kind of a technique where I leave these highlights in it. And for that, we do need a bit of a smaller brush just to get in there and do it. So the thing about working with a larger watercolor brush than you might be immediately comfortable with is you're going to be able to cover more of an area. It's not going to dry as quickly, and it's not going to be as streaky and as patchy. And this is particularly true on the less expensive cellulose papers. Now, larger watercolor brushes can be expensive, so typically I would recommend that you go synthetic for those while you build up your watercolor brush collection. And I'll just be real with you guys, just as it took me years to build up a collection of paints that I know and that I love, it has taken me years to build up a collection of brushes. And buying one or two of the smaller, less expensive brushes to see if I like how they handle, and then if I do, saving up my money and investing in the larger brushes. And taking good care of your watercolor brushes, cleaning them out, don't let the paint dry in them, using a paint puck, which is like a little silicone scrubber at the bottom of your water cup, using brush conditioner to wash your brushes, and hanging your brushes with the brush side down to dry. That can all really prolong the life of your brush. But I also have to say, the fact that my cat can no longer get at my brushes has also prolonged the life of my brush. And if you take good care of your expensive brushes, they should last you a really long time. So while they are an investment, it's not like it's something that you're going to be constantly rebuying. Remember how I mentioned earlier that if you wanted a lot of contrast, you could do a blue sky for this? Well, I decided that I did want a pop of contrast, so I'm using ultramarine blue mixed with a little bit of cerulean blue for her eyes. And I like that so much that I'm going to use that on the band of her hat. Now, that might be too much contrast and too small a space. So if you're painting along with me, obviously you can choose not to do this. You can choose to do this. Whatever makes your heart sing. You could use the blue on her apron instead and really get some nice contrast going. It's really up to you. So on the stems, I started with a layer of yellow ochre. Let that dry. On some of them, I'm doing undersea green. On some of them, I'm doing Van Dyke brown. On some of them, I'm doing a little bit of sepia. It really just kind of depends on what you think it needs and how much contrast you want to bring to that area. So we've got almost everything blocked in, but I have been putting off painting the cats because I really just cannot decide which cat I want to be an orange cat and which cat I want to be a black cat. Finally, I decided the cat behind her is going to be a black cat, so I've mixed a little bit of probably carbon black, it might be lamp black, a little bit of Payne's gray, so we get kind of a nice color, and it's pretty watered down because with black, if you want to build up contrast, if you want to build up shadow, yeah, you can go straight in with black and then add white highlights a la The Void. But I wanted to kind of build up the black so it looks like this cat has really nice, sleek, shiny fur, especially because this is a fluffier black cat. So my first cat was a black cat. That would be Midnight. And I still have a special place in my heart for black cats. I really, really love them. And did you guys know that in cats, the expression of or gray fur is a dilute expression of black? So my gray cat Bowie, oh my goodness, my gray cat Bowie is basically a black cat, and black cats have always brought me luck. And the little orange cat down at the bottom was inspired both by my cat Remy, who passed away unfortunately from a sarcoma. Well, we had to say goodbye to her before she passed away from that, but she had a sarcoma in her mouth. She was 16, and it's been a few years since we said goodbye to Rems, but the orange cat is inspired by both Remy as well as my family's cat Dax, who is a big, not big, he looks big, but he's actually very small, but he acts like he's a big boy. Fluffy orange cat that they found outside in O'Reilly's. So we have a little bit of Midnight / Bowie, and we have a little bit of Remy / Dax here in the illustration. Whenever I draw animals, especially if it's like geckos, cats, rats, it's always based on animals that I have known and love. I always love to put some of my pets in my illustrations. Now, for our orange cat, we have a really watered down orange as a base because we're going to make this an orange tabby. And that is pretty simple. We're mixing up a little bit of yellow and dabbing that in while it's still wet here and there, leaving the tummy a little bit of a cream color. And we are going to also add in a little bit more orange. And we're going to start, while that's still wet, to add in a little bit of the striping. It is going to diffuse out, but it's going to also give that kind of diluted tabby orange undercolor that you guys will see with creamsicle tabbies. So now I want to add some blush to her face. I'm using Alizarin Crimson, which is a cooler red for this, and I'm adding it to her cheeks, to her nose, to her lips, to the tops of her eyelids. I would also add it to her fingertips, her kneecaps, her toes, the joints of her fingers, basically anywhere skin overlaps skin, so underneath her jawline. And it's just going to add some liveliness and some life to the illustration. Now that our orangey cat has had a chance to dry, I'm going in with our quinacridone burnt sienna, which is kind of a rusty red, and I am just doing little bitty strippity stripes along the back. I am referencing this, by the way, because even though I have had a couple of orange cats in my life, I still want to do them justice, and I don't want to just rely on my very faulty, not photo memory to be able to capture orange cats in all of their two brain cell glory. That said, Remy was extremely intelligent, but she was a female Manx orange tabby, so I guess she got all the brain cells. Dax, though, is so cute and so dumb and so bitey. So once her hat has fully dried, I am using a masking fluid pickup, and I got this one from Dollar Tree. It's just a booger made of masking fluid bits to remove the masking fluid. Some people can use their fingers. Sjogren's syndrome has made my hands extremely dry, so I actually can't do that. And I find the masking fluid pickup just does a much better job than I could. You don't even have to scrub. You just lightly dab it in the areas where the masking fluid is, and the masking fluid will stick to the pickup, and it will allow you to very easily remove masking fluid with a greatly reduced chance of actually tearing up your paper. So if you struggle to remove masking fluid from your paper, try using a masking fluid pickup. I'm using a little bit of our undersea green to paint the vine on our pumpkin stem. And at this point, everything has been blocked in. Most of the shadows have been painted. And we're really just kind of finessing things. We're making things a little bit darker, adding a little bit more contrast. We might be cleaning things up a little bit. I'm painting the interior of her mouth so you guys can actually see her teeth. We're just basically adding the finishing touches. Now, for full disclosure, I spent a couple hours in an evening sketching this, a couple hours in a different evening inking it, and then I spent probably about 5 hours, including the dry times, painting it, and then the next morning I added in the finishing touches. So don't feel like you need to rush this. Please don't rush this. This has been time-lapse. It's been sped up. It has been edited. Please do not compare what you experience in real life and how long art takes you to make in real life with an edited version on YouTube. This is meant to educate and this is meant to inspire, but I get very disheartened as a teacher because a lot of my students will see things they see online, not know the whole context because none of us are sharing the full story, and will beat themselves up or not like their art or feel frustrated or discouraged because they're struggling with something. So I just want to kind of disclose as much as I can with you guys and just kind of make it a little bit less mysterious. So you guys see how the paint in my ceramic palette has all dried out. I let it dry overnight. I gave myself a break. I gave myself a rest. I went to sleep. I came back to it with fresh eyes and I said, oh, hey, we need more contrast in the skin. And look, time has worked in my favor because the paints have dried out. They can be very easily reconstituted with just a little bitty bit of clean water. And this allows us access to more saturated versions of the colors that we were working with. So time and evaporation in watercolor are definitely your friend if you know how to use that. And I'm using ceramic for this, so I have a little ceramic daisy palette, and then what you guys see over to the right is actually a spoon rest that I picked up at the Asian food market, and I really like it because it is perfect for mixing up larger washes of watercolor. It has this little chopstick rest next to it that's perfect for resting my brush on if I want, and it has a little pour spout, so if I want to do pour watercolor techniques, it works well for that as well. And I think I paid maybe $2 for it. Most of my ceramic palettes, unless they're like little divoted well palettes like the Daisy palette here, either came from Dollar Tree from the plate section or from my Asian food mart from the plate section. If you have a Daiso, that might also be an excellent place to find fun art and watercolor supplies. Obviously, in their art section, but not so obviously in their houseware section. If you guys know of any fun art supplies that are not sold in conventional art supply stores, let me know about them. Your fun kind of hack together art supplies and art supply recommendations. Let me know what it is and where you find it, because I am always on the lookout for fun, unconventional art supplies. In fact, I have a video where I talk about places you can go to acquire studio and art supplies on a budget, and I'll try to remember to link that for you guys. Anyway, I am just kind of adding in our final, most saturated details. I'm trying to add in more shadow. I'm trying to add in more contrast. I'm trying to clarify things when necessary. And I am probably working with the smallest version of the brush that I am going to use for that thing, because we are adding in details. And once everything has had a chance to dry, I pull out my crusty, dusty tube of white gouache. And gouache is just an opaque watercolor. It has a higher pigment load, but it's basically the same thing. And you can water it down and use it as a watercolor if you wish. I know that some watercolor purists do not like gouache for adding highlights. Y'all, I am a watercolor comic artist and I do what I want. And I encourage you to do the same thing. So I'm just going to use our white gouache to add in some rim lighting, to add in some highlights, to clarify things. I am gross, and I will actually drop a little clean water into the tube itself, let that soak in, and then I will just kind of squeegee my brush around in the tube rather than squeezing out a dollop of gouache. I used to waste a lot of gouache squeezing out a dollop of gouache on my palette and then not finishing using it and then washing it off the palette. So swirling the brush around in the tube of gouache is less wasteful, and I'm happy with it. So even if it's a little bit gross, it works for me. At this point, it's all finishing touches. Do you want to add some more contrast? Add some more contrast. Do you want to re-ink it to add some more contrast here and there? You can do that too. If you want to use a color other than white gouache, you can either add a little bit of the watercolor color from your palette into your gouache to get that secondary color, or you can grab another tube of white gouache, whatever you want. This is all about making this little sketchbook illustration look the way you want it to look, the way that makes you happy, and the way that makes your brain go burr. For our little black cat, I am using a little bit of white gouache just to add some white whiskers, to add some white eyelashes so the eyes don't get so lost in that. But other than that, we are pretty much done. I had so much fun painting this with you guys. I hope you guys had as much fun hanging out with me. I hope that you leave this feeling all inspired to make your own spooky or spooky season Halloween art. If you do, I would love to see it. Tag me at NatoSoup, or you can share it in the finished art channel of my art-centric Discord server, the Paint Box. I will try to remember to leave a link for you guys down in the description below. Don't forget to check the description for more videos, for recommended playlists, for all of the materials that we're using here. And if you join me over on Patreon at patreon.com/NatoSoup, you can download the line art, and that way you can just paint if you want to. You could also hand it off to someone else and let them have a little bit of Halloween coloring fun. Thank you guys so much for drawing, inking, and painting along with me today. If you're looking for some more start to finish art tutorials, I got you covered, friends. Whether or not you celebrate Halloween, I hope you stay safe this season. And if you do celebrate Halloween, I hope you come home with lots of candy. Huge thanks to my amazing patrons over on Patreon. You guys have the line art for this. Make sure you check it. Your name could be added to the list if you join me. They are why these tutorials are possible. So thank you guys so much. So here are some more playlists as well as a link to my Patreon if you guys would like to join me.